Patrick Hicks Music Stories presents Every Grammys Ever, the 16th Annual Grammy Awards, March 2nd, 1974. We are back in Los Angeles this year. Andy Williams is hosting again, but the important thing about tonight is that the Stevie Wonder era of the Grammys has begun. Stevie Wonder is the most nominated artist this year with 7 nominations, from both 1973's Intervisions and 1972's Talking Book. The eligibility year for the Grammys in the 70s is real wonky. It usually goes from October to October. So this year it was October 16th, 1972 to October 15th, 1973. I will talk about this more as the years go on, but I absolutely hate this. If we're talking about the album of the year, it should go by the calendar year. There is no other source that is measuring what's the best album of the year that doesn't just use the calendar year. So if I'm going to Rolling Stone to find out what were the best albums of 1973, they're not going to put Talking Book in there just because it came out in October. I'll save the rest of my ranting for future years where this is a bigger problem. But we see a song from Talking Book nominated for Song of the Year and Record of the Year. Also in both categories you have the Carly Simon classic You're So Vain, but the winner in both categories for the second year in a row is Roberta Flack for her song Killing Me Softly with His Song.
I'm in my bed with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song.
By the way, have you ever wondered whose song was Killing Softly, the singer of the song Killing Me Softly with His Song? It turns out it was, of all people, Don McLean of American Pie fame, who Roberta Flack had beaten at the Grammys the year before. The original version of this song was written by this young songwriter named Lori Lieberman, who was inspired by seeing Don McLean sing. And then the song gets kind of taken over by her managers, the more experienced songwriters Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox, and they take all the credit. They're the ones that actually accept the Song of the Year Grammy. Speaking of Record of the Year, one of the songs nominated in that category is Bad Bad Leroy Brown by Jim Croce, who had tragically passed away in 1973. He gets another nomination that night for Bad Bad Leroy Brown in the category Best Pop Vocal Performance Male, which he loses to Stevie Wonder, but when Stevie Wonder accepts, he dedicates the award to Jim. Jim ends up never winning a Grammy, but some artists that do win their first Grammys tonight are Neil Diamond, who wins his first and only Grammy in the category Album of Best Original Score Written for a Motion Picture or Television Special for Jonathan Livingston Seagull. He had had a couple nominations before and would have a total of 13, but only this one win. And Gladys Knight and the Pips, who also had some previous nominations, they win 2 tonight. One for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus for Neither One of Us Wants to Be the First to Say Goodbye, and Best R&B Vocal Performance by a Duo, Group, or Chorus for Midnight Train to Georgia. Also getting their first nominations, by default, are the Best New Artist nominees. You have artists like Barry White and Marie Osmond, but the winner ends up being Bette Midler. And now for the nominees for Album of the Year. You have Roberta Flack getting nominated for the album Killing Me Softly. Best New Artist winner Bette Midler is nominated for The Divine Miss M. The country artist Charlie Rich is nominated for Behind Closed Doors. You have Paul Simon, now split from Simon and Garfunkel with his album There Goes Rhymin' Simon. And then Stevie Wonder doesn't get an Album of the Year nomination for Talking Book, but he does for Intervisions. But before we get to the winner, let's talk about some albums from 1973 that were not nominated. Now, as always, the Grammys remain completely disconnected from what is, by this point, the most popular genre of music, rock and roll. Do you know what album came out in 1973? Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. This is where sometimes the Grammys just don't make sense to me. When people say they just reward chart success and album sales, okay, then why did they not give any nominations to Dark Side of the Moon? It's one of the best-selling albums of all time. It was a #1 hit in the US. It was still on the Billboard charts when the Grammys were taking place. This is worse than if the Grammys just gave awards to the most popular and the best-selling albums. This means that the premier music awards show that is supposed to recognize the best music completely ignored an album that by any metric you want to use, whether it's charts or sales or critical reviews, is one of the most important albums in history. I'm not even the biggest Pink Floyd fan, but I think if I was in charge of the Grammys and we had failed to give a single nomination to Dark Side of the Moon, I would have burned the whole thing to the ground and started over. Now that's the big one, but there still are some other huge snubs. Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy, you knew they weren't getting anything. David Bowie's Aladdin Sane, I mean, if he didn't get nominated for Ziggy Stardust, he wasn't going to get nominated for this, but What is going on with the Grammys and David Bowie? Marvin Gaye continues to get ignored with his album Let's Get It On. The Stooges album Raw Power, again, it wasn't going to get nominated, but I gotta mention it. You have Bob Marley's breakthrough with the Wailers' Catch a Fire. And then you have The Who's Quadrophenia. The Who, at this point, I mean, there's nothing they can do to get nominated. I don't know how nobody working at the Grammys thought, hey, maybe we should create a category like Best Rock Album. That's an award, by the way, that they don't create until 1995. And the Album of the Year Grammy goes to
Stevie Wonder for Inner Visions.
Stevie Wonder's Inner Visions. This was probably a close one for Grammy voters since two of their favorites, Stevie Wonder and Paul Simon, were going against each other, but there's no denying Stevie this year. I wouldn't have minded this winning even if Dark Side of the Moon was nominated. Stevie Wonder is a genius, and this is one of the best albums of his classic period. Billboard magazine actually did a ranking of every Album of the Year winner from the Grammys, and they put this album at number 1. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time for the highs and lows of the 17th Annual Grammy Awards in 1975.
So